Actively managing your personal brand is critical if you want to make a significant impact in the areas of your life important to you. I'm Garry Browne, the Personal Brand Catalyst. I've spent most of my life working in the world of branding products. More recently, I've been exploring the world of personal branding and wrote a book on this, Brand New, Brand You. And the podcast has come out of this as a way to share first-hand experiences from some of Australia's most recognised personal brands. Hagai Segal is a multi-award-winning academic and internationally renowned consultant, commentator and keynote speaker. Renowned for his ability to explain and contextualise constantly evolving global political events and crises. Hagai is a leading authority on geopolitical issues, strategic risk, the Middle East and counter-terrorism. At the centre of what Hagai does best is his unique ability to look beyond the obvious headlines or superficial news analysis and pinpoint pivotal connections between international scenarios as they unfold. He uses these valuable insights to deliver highly topical keynote speeches on an international stage, helping corporations, financial institutions, business groups, NGOs, police forces and security agencies make sense of the increasingly complicated and globalised world in which we live. Hagai, thank you so much for taking the time to have a chat today, knowing that being on the other side of the world, it's always challenging to find the right time. But with you, we always make the time because your insights, your knowledge and your feedback are always something that I've valued, and I know that today will be a really interesting discussion. So thank you very much for joining.
Thanks so much, Garry, and thank you for the invite. It's a real pleasure to do this.
Hagai, as I said in the introduction, we are talking with you because of the knowledge, the insights, and your understanding of complexity. Complexity in terms of life in general. And I suspect that is not something that was just handed to you, that it's come over time. How did you start your early life in your studies and your learning to come to where you are today?
It's a really interesting story, I think, to some extent, and it's something I'll talk later in terms of how I think it's informed my perception of my brand, which is that in many ways I had no idea what I wanted to do with my life, as most young people don't. And so when I went to university, I just did what I was passionate about. I come from a family which was had political opinions. My grandfather, my mother's father, was a trade union activist who helped organise the anti-fascist marches and events in London in 1936, known as Cable Street. So I came from a family where, politics mattered, and taking a view and being involved in the world and not being a passive citizen was just a default of our value set. And what that meant was that when I really didn't know what I'd do in my life, I went and studied politics. And at the end of my degree, and I still wasn't quite sure what I was doing, I continued to study politics. And what I realized was that this passion for it, but also an interest for it, and then starting to realize that people seemed to think that I was able to understand and explain those events, led me to have the confidence to realize that this was something that I wanted and could do as a career. But of course, you've also going to realize how you do that. Learning that I could be this mix of a formal academic with someone who then goes out into the real world and works with businesses and governments and others to try and help explain and contextualize these events. And I think what's really important about your question is that I'm still deeply passionate about what I do and what I talk about. The subject matter continues to interest and fascinate me. And the idea that I can help people who are influenced by world events, who also are interested in world events, but maybe don't feel they understand them, that I can help them with some insight, with some understanding, even that I can help them in how in their own particular world they can use that information in a meaningful way in terms of decision making, that continues to give me an enormous amount of pleasure, satisfaction, as well as being something that I hope has been a very successful career.
And there's no doubt that there are many years of that to continue.
Sadly, I think in the contemporary political environment, there's little doubt about that, yeah.
So tell me, do you think of yourself as a brand, or do you think yourself as Hagai?
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting. And as I've been pondering this before doing the podcast, it's really interesting how that began to develop. I do see myself as a brand, but it took a long time to recognize that and get the confidence to recognize that. And what I mean by that is that when decades ago I first sat down with my management team at the time to do my website, of course, on your website, you're suddenly describing to the world what you are, and you're having to choose how you do that. And, if you're a company, when you're saying we all the time, there's an element of the third person. But when suddenly you're writing on your own website, I am an expert, I am a thought leader. My team was saying to me, you're an expert, you're a thought leader. And I'm like, but I can't, am I allowed to say that about myself? And I think what's interesting here is culture. Like in Britain, it's considered almost, faux pas that you would dare have the confidence to make these kind of credentials about yourself. But what I also think was interesting in how I began to formulate that idea of who I am, how I represent myself, how I see myself, how others see myself, therefore what my brand was that, I come from an academic world where there's lots of labels. You're a lecturer, you're a professor, you're an academic. But I think actually those words can be harmful if you want to be a keynote speaker, if you want to take your expertise into the wider world, because for many people, the word academic is boring, or it's kind of a bit ivory tower. It suggests that you live in this world of research where, you might write interesting papers sitting in an office, but have you ever seen the real world? And what I realized was that I needed to find a way of using and getting credit for the academic credentials, the experience, the high level of knowledge that I can convey that came from that, but also creating a dynamic around how I was somebody who operated in the real world, that I can speak to a board, that I can speak to a bank because I actually understand their issues. And so it was really interesting as I began to go through that process of how on the page that, when anyone wants to find out about me, that's where they first go. What is that brand that I'm putting out there? How am I finding that balance between the academic credentials that I've worked very hard to get and that I'm proud of, but understanding that if they're too dry, they're almost a negative in the real world. And it also created a really interesting introspective thought process that I went through for many years around concepts, like, how I do see myself. Also, not just how I brand myself, but what my brand is wanting to achieve. And going back to what you were saying just now, the idea that it's not me about peddling an opinion. It's about having people saying, this guy's great because no matter what's going on in the world, no matter how politicized it is, no matter how angry and polarized the debate, here's someone who's able to stand back and say, here's some of the parameters, here's some of the factual dynamics, here's how you can think about them, whatever your particular political perspective. And so while I think if you say to me, say 3 words that are your brand, I'd probably smile and say, well, every 6 months you might ask me and I'd come up with different ideas. I think that kind of self-perception of my brand continues to be, after more than 20 years of work, an ongoing dynamic and an ongoing conversation. I think I realized very quickly it was about how my reputation, my sense of what matters to me in terms of my work, trust and integrity around the ability to stand back and neutrally assess these events, that became central in that beginning of the development of a self-perception of my brand.
So if we think about you as a lecturer, do your students talk about the guy that talks about geopolitics, or do they talk about Hagai, the great inspiration?
Well, you see, here's the modest British guy coming in who can't possibly answer the last part of that question. But yeah, I think it's really interesting. And one of the things about those words I said before, those kind of labels, which aren't necessarily brands and almost can get in the way of it, like, academic, etc. A word I think I have embraced over the years is educator. That idea that, whether I'm sitting in a classroom or whether I'm, doing a keynote speech to a conference or a corporation, that I'm helping use knowledge to get people to a more informed place where they have the confidence to then think about these issues and even talk about them to other people. And that's the greatest satisfaction I think I get from my students, is when, 5 years later, I'll have a message from a student saying, "Hi, Professor, I just wanted to say I've been watching the news and I was able to have not just talk, but actually explain some of the events to my parents sitting next to me on the sofa because of something I had in your class." And and in some ways that's a very simple thing, but there's something incredibly satisfying to know that you've helped people on their journey in terms of those kind of knowledge dynamics. And that I think is where I have chosen to place myself and is central to how I see my brand, is in a world increasingly where knowledge has become attacked, where the idea of a fact is now being essentially eroded. People are talking about post-fact, etc. I think it's more important than ever that we have the ability to take knowledge and to take information and to demand that people make informed decisions based not on biases or the consequences of carefully manipulated propaganda, but rather around knowledge and depth. And that word expert I used before, I think is really interesting in that regard. During the Brexit debate in the UK, we had a very prominent British political figure come out and say the British public has had enough of experts. And what was amazing about that was we had someone who didn't particularly want to engage in debates about statistics or factual parameters, and in fact turned the word expert from a credential into an insult. And so I think in some ways today we live in a world where knowledge is being attacked at a fundamental level. And I'm more passionate than ever, therefore, and thankfully there's thousands and thousands of other people who are as well, of the importance of continuing to ensure that people are informed and they make informed decisions. And I think it's quite right that we don't want an elitist thing about this. For me, education is about access. It's not about people being cleverer than other people. And so that idea that I'm an educator, not that I'm better than someone or higher than someone, but I am part of a process of engaging in an educational dynamic, that I think is a core element of how I see myself and how my brand kind of aligns with my values.
But I think what you also have articulated is that you're providing knowledge to people to help them not what to think, but how to think. And that is incredibly important. And I think if we talk about today's environment, people have not been given that opportunity, and hence we're losing that skill of challenge and debate. And we've moved way away from those very basics of how you should learn and understand. And so your brand is actually very much stronger than probably what you think it is.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that's fascinating. And, it goes back to your question before about complexity, and which is that one of the things that I try and challenge a lot in my work is that many people think that the world today is too complicated for them to understand. And why I think that's very dangerous is that people then say, well, I therefore don't have to be an active participant. I don't have to impact decision making. Now, when I'm working with a company, I'm addressing a board, and that board is saying, well, look, geopolitics is too complicated, so we're not even going to look at it. And in effect, they're abrogating responsibility for preparedness and resilience of their organization. That's one thing. But I think this today goes down to ordinary people and whether they choose to, for example, vote in elections or not. This is too complicated. I want no part of it. And, if we go back to the dark days of fascism in the 1930s, what was very clever about those kind of politicians was they said people don't like complexity, they want simplicity. And what they did was they said, forget the complexity. I'm going to tell you yes, no, good, bad, black, white, and just give me the responsibility and I'll go away and do something about it. And we're seeing a return in some ways to some of that politics in the world. I think people are very much more are aware of that history, but there's still a very natural human comfort for the world's too complicated. I don't want to spend all my time understanding it. I'm just going to give that responsibility to somebody else. And I think this is a conversation that, as I say, in my work I have with the boards, the corporations, the organizations, the entire business sectors that I work with. But also I think there's a real value with my students of helping them become confident and active citizens, that they can ensure that the next generation of decision makers, but also just ordinary voters, are people who care about the fact that they will make informed decisions and informed decision making. So interesting on a kind of my work at a very individual level with an individual student to something on a macro level with a huge corporation. I think the same principles can apply. And, without giving myself too much credit, I only do it in my own small part, but hopefully enough people are doing that. There's an importance in trying to challenge a world in which, you say we've had enough of experts, as if people with knowledge and people with insight should be viewed as a negative, not as a positive.
So let's take the point of experts, your position, and think about reputation. Reputation, obviously, in your line of work, is built up over time. When is it that it became important to you, or that it became a critical area of focus in your career?
It was actually quite relatively early. The beginning of my career happened to coincide with 9/11, and that ended up being something which really kind of put me in a lot of these places I wouldn't have naturally found myself. Suddenly giving briefings for government, suddenly being flown around the world by corporations who suddenly realize that their businesses are being affected by political events, in many ways was very lucky for me in that I didn't have to create these dynamics. But what it very quickly became very, very clear was how important it was that if somebody was to challenge me of, with respect, sir, who are you to tell me these things, that I was confident, let alone that I could give them the credentials, that was the case. And one of the things that I think is really interesting about that is that if you work in my kind of world, one of the ways you can develop the credentials of reputation is with clearances. And, I'm often get asked by people, people assume you work in these kind of fields, and particularly things like international security, that, you're a spy or you're James Bond or you're this kind of stuff. But actually what's important about that is that one of the ways to do these kind of jobs is through getting security clearances. You actively, enter the system. You're given access to secrets. I, from the very beginning, decided that that's not what I wanted to do. That what I wanted to do was to develop relationships with these kind of agencies, that they were using me for one reason and one reason only, that they knew and trusted that I was a trusted, neutral voice who had no axe to grind, who there wasn't an agenda at play, but is there to try and bring depth of analysis. And as a consequence, there's a limit to what I can do. If I work with a national security agency or a police force or whatever it is, there's certain rooms I'm not allowed to walk into, let alone certain discussions I cannot have. But actually, it gives me a level of access that some people with security clearance don't have, because what the conversations that I'm having, the briefings that I'm being given are not because, oh, we want someone from this following tier and this person is in it, but rather is instead for one reason and one reason only. This is a person that we believe we want to hear and want to listen to. But you're right, that takes a long time to develop. Credentials, real credentials, are not magically created. You can't just come up with a good marketing paragraph and put it on your website and suddenly you have those things. But at the same time, what also happened around that time was, because at the time, the massive emphasis on 24-hour news television, we didn't have the Twitters, etc. yet, having a real influence in the world, was that I was on CNN, I was on the BBC, I was on Sky. And, what I learned from that is also the power of what almost is the fake credential. If you're on CNN, well, instantly people assume you must have a voice that's valid. Whereas there are people who might have been much more eminent than me who weren't on CNN. And there's people who maybe didn't have that knowledge or that authenticity who were appearing on the BBC or the CNN, etc. And so what I also learned was not to get overexcited by the fake credentials and understand the long-term value of developing something as simple as trust and integrity. And I'm always careful with those terms. I think, you've always got to be sure with yourself around that. And that's always why I say to people, I do analysis, not answers, right? I never, I think the minute you think in my world that the answer to something, you stop really doing that neutral, knowledge-based analysis. But yeah, reputation was hugely, hugely important. But what I think I'm saying here is that there are different ways in which in any environment you can choose to develop those reputations. Some ways are about them having created through qualifications and credentials by, having things set very officially. But what I valued and believed that I would benefit from most, and I'm very proud of, is that, I have got where I am through people's recognizing that I come with a level of knowledge and have an interest in giving it for the benefit of their insight, not because I'm pushing particular viewpoints or perspectives.
And to add to what you're saying is that your values are such that those who are seeking your counsel have aligned to your values, and that has helped you build your reputation. Would you concur with that?
Yeah, the irony of that is that if you're too strong on values, it can lose you work. I think everybody does this. There's always going to be certain companies or corporations you won't work with, and you have to kind of make that call. But also, what I've learned in my keynote kind of work is while I know, and the clients who use me know, that my work is much more relevant than just someone who wants to talk on geopolitics. What I do has a broader impact on businesses, on boards, on decision making. There's elements there around the change management agenda and recognizing the role of understanding as you're advancing and developing and modernizing a business, of the impact of politics on that. Huge issues around preparedness and resilience and business continuity, etc. dynamics.
But what do you mean by big value? When you're too big on values, you don't necessarily get them. What do you mean by that?
Well, what I mean by that is that you can become almost too niche. You can become too focused. Going back to what I was saying at the very beginning about when I first wrote my website and my brand, one of the things I've learned over the years is that while for the many firms and conferences and others, etc., who use me, they immediately know, because they've seen me in action, why someone who is an academic and an analyst on geopolitics is relevant to their businesses. You'd be amazed how many businesses and business sectors would never look at someone like me as a speaker, because what they think is all he is going to do is talk about Ukraine and Gaza. Actually, what I'm doing is using my knowledge and my insights and hopefully frameworks that are usable, manageable, actionable, as a way of getting businesses to be able to make much more informed decision making about the world in which they live. But a continuing challenge of my brand is, how do you tell that to someone who hasn't seen you in action? How do you convey the fact that you are a person who is a business speaker? You're not a geopolitics speaker. That your analysis, your consultancy is relevant, not just because you've just opened a mine in a highly politicized environment, not because you're an international business who now is dealing with supply chain problems or sanctions, right? The vast majority of people who still come to me, and it's still the developing challenge of my brand, are those who directly are saying, geopolitics is hurting us, let's go and find a geopolitical expert. Where actually what I offer is something that has application for much more wider businesses. If you become too associated with particular subjects or particular dynamics around who and what you are, that makes you limited and puts you within a niche. And so I think it's that interesting dynamic of finding the pride and the confidence in your values and who you are and what you are, but also not actually limiting yourself in the corporate environment in which you operate as a consequence.
Understand. If I translate that back, you're a catalyst for change, and you use geopolitics as the methodology and the catalyst to make people think a different way. That's the way I see you. And the fact that geopolitics is something people want you to speak on is because they find it fascinating. And there is no right answer. But we live in a global village, and everyone wants to know what the future brings and what they can do about it or be involved in it if necessary.
Absolutely. And I think, what's key about that in the current political environment is that I think 20, 30 years ago, companies could have pretended that they're not going to be affected by global events, that they only have peripheral and very specific impacts on their business. I think today, any organization that is seeking change, any organization that is seeking to say, how are we future-proofing our business? How are we making sure that we're in the right place? I challenge them to say, you cannot pretend you're not living in this world. And you also shouldn't make the mistake of thinking that you are a slave to it, that someone has forcibly tied you to a roller coaster and you're going to go up and down and upside down and backwards, and you have no choice in the matter. Quite the opposite, actually. What I find with many I work for is when they embrace this idea that they can begin to engage in political events and understand them, rather than it scaring them off, it does the opposite. It creates their ability to take advantage of opportunities because they're no longer scared. And so it's actually about, there can be great profitability and opportunity identification for those who understand the embrace of politics. But again, it goes back to that thing about academia. I still find myself in situations where people think that, if they want to engage in geopolitics, they're going to have to send their entire board to do a master's, or they've all got to do PhDs. And again, I'm trying to explain to them that's not what this is about. This is about a mindset. This is about an organization collectively saying, how do we develop a focus, a conversation? It's not about everybody becoming authorities within these areas. And this goes back to classic ways in which businesses operate. This is about the risk register. This is about the audit committee. This is about fulfilling basic legal requirements around, regulatory environments in which you operate domestically and internationally. So this is actually core business functioning, but it's saying, how do we understand this in the world in which we're living, whether you want to admit that that is the world we're living or not? The quicker we adapt to those realities, the quicker we're living in a business in the 21st century. And it's something I know I've mentioned to you before, but I think it's interesting to bring up in this discussion is I still find myself in companies, for example, introducing the head of security to the head of information security, head of IT, because they've never met each other.
Because
we still have organizations who are organized like it's the 1990s. And because they don't want to address these issues, what's actually going on is it's not just they're not looking at geopolitics. What they're not doing is modernizing their governance, modernizing their board structure, modernizing their lines of communication and their lines of reporting within the business to make sure that they are truly structured and aligned for the challenges that face them in the 21st century. The work that I do goes well beyond geopolitics, but convincing people of that when they might simply see your brand as geopolitics, that I think is something that is still a very active part of my branding, of the way in which I project myself to the world, and the way in which I engage in those that I'm beginning a commercial relationship with.
Absolutely. So values are very important to you. And as we said earlier, that plays a significant part in your reputation, your recognition, and your relevance. Have your values ever been tested?
I would say that my values are constantly tested, and I almost actively kind of set that up. As I say, I come into my entire career from a family background of activism, and I've chosen to rather be the analyst that gives the information rather than choosing activism on particular perspectives. But I think the idea that we need to be constantly engaged with what's going on in the world, that we must have knowledge, we must be making decisions around this. I'm constantly finding myself in environments where I'm having to make that argument, where I'm finding people are saying to me with respect, that's not how a board should operate, or that's not how we're going to be doing this. And I think that's done over the years is only reinforced the fact that a lot of what I do is based on those fundamental viewpoints and values and ethics to some extent that I hold. And as I say, I think we're in a world today where basic ideas of truth are again being challenged, that is more important than ever. And if we're having decision making in which people no longer say there needs to be integrity, there needs to be trust, and maybe a way to put this is, I think we now live in a world where perception is more important than reality. And that is very, very dangerous, where truth is not what is going on. Truth is the person who sells it best. And there's a lot of debate today about how young people, more of the news they read comes to them from social media than from traditional media. Is that properly regulated? Is that properly filtered? Is it just a manipulation and a propaganda exercise? Someone like Vladimir Putin and Russia today, a huge amount of their wealth and their political activity is being spent on manipulating information for political imperative. What do we do in a world like that? I think that means that my values are challenged more than ever. But in many ways, that it has only reinvigorated me on the importance of a knowledge-based dynamic. And again, I emphasized before that I've realized quite quickly in my career, it's important that isn't elitist. It's important that you're not saying, I know more than you. I'm more important than you. Your job is to listen to me and go, oh, aren't I lucky to have your insight? Rather, my value here is that I have knowledge, which doesn't mean I have the answers, which doesn't mean that people can't disagree with me. It doesn't mean that people will quite rightly take issue with what I raise, but that I have a level of knowledge and a level of experience that hopefully can help people be better informed and be better informed decision makers. But yeah, we live in a world where that today is being fundamentally critiqued and challenged. And so, I take that as an almost a demand that my values are not passive; they're an active. They remain and are reinforced as an active part of my work and the way in which I do it.
Have you ever walked away from an environment where the values were not in line with the way you perceive things? Walked away from a project or a job that really was not up to your expectations?
Yeah, luckily it's not happened, but that's because I'm very careful with my due diligence, and of course I think sometimes it's luck. I think far more the answer to your question is the amount of times I've politely said no to a potential client in the understanding that there is no way in which I can do that. Now, there are many sectors and clients I work with where I believe that I can have a value going in. I've had people challenge me on, corporations and sectors that I work with. I have absolutely no problem defending my values in that regard, in that, me helping them move into an oil company discussing about how they're moving into a post-carbon world and the role in which I can help with them understanding geopolitics, the ways in which they can do that. I feel I'm very much contributing in a positive way to those agendas. And I think, standing on a high horse is not my idea of what values really are. It's very easy for somebody to put a post on Twitter when they're followed by a few million people and say, I've just, put a middle finger up to this particular person, and they get all excited about it. I think that leads to unhelpful activism, where often you get kind of blind swipes at entire organizations and sectors in order to have cheap point scoring, rather than really about assessing whether that action helps lead to your true ethical and moral and reputational outcomes. And so there are, those I simply cannot work with because of their values or because of the work that they do. But actually, I actively work with those who some might not do so, because I believe I can help them. And that goes to your point about catalyst for change. I can help them through my work and my insight, together with others, of course, but I can play a role in helping them move into the kind of economy, the kind of employers, the kind of world in which we are improving, we are modernizing, we are addressing negative issues of the past, and we're moving into hopefully a better world. And as I say, I don't give myself more credit than I deserve. I only play a small role within that. But that, gives me confidence that my work is aligning with those values. But yes, I have regularly turned down work. I tend to politely say I can't do it in my schedule, or find a way to do it, rather than telling people that I think that their work is immoral. I rather try and do it through scheduling rather than through conflict. But yes, I have regularly turned down lucrative work based on the fact that I simply will not be able to rectify it within my own sense of value and worth.
So have you been in what about an environment where you've either taken out of context, or you've been in an environment where you've had to share the stage with someone who's you thought was aligned but became malaligned to the topic and the issues? It can be.
Yeah,
has that occurred?
That has happened, and I hadn't thought about that when you asked the question. And it happened a lot more earlier in my career, and now I'm incredibly careful with who I share platforms with. Once bitten, twice shy, but absolutely. The problem with talking about controversial issues in geopolitics is that people get put on who have controversial viewpoints on geopolitics. And, I will not share a platform with a jihadist, right? Even if the broadcaster isn't aware that that person is a jihadist, right? So there's a couple of times I've been on the radio and said, and what I'll do, by the way, is I will say, the person sitting next to me has the following perspective. This is the organization they're from. I will not share a platform with them, and then leave. But I'll give the quick 30-second explanation to the audience about why, they shouldn't do that. But yes, I've found myself on occasion. I think the vast majority of cases, if I'm on a platform, on a panel with somebody who has those viewpoints, I will rather use the opportunity to try and challenge and maybe even discredit those viewpoints in an appropriate way for the audience. I often find it interesting that people think that, in a media interview like we're doing now, when you're talking one-on-one, that you're just having a conversation with the person. Well, if it's being broadcast, what you're having a much more conversation with the larger audience that's listening. And so if it's not a fundamental objection to sharing a platform with that person, rather than just leave it or shout, I would rather actually use that platform to engage in a way in which the audience would join me in recognizing why those viewpoints are problematic. But I think often, most cases where this happens, I think it's somebody who has either had some kind of throwaway line, or I don't think they understand the factual issues. And again, that's why I bring in, hopefully, knowledge and informational dynamics that are able to provide tangible reasons why people should be cynical of such a perspective and such a viewpoint. So I think more often than not, I just engage carefully in challenging the view. I learned very early, once bitten, twice shy, is make damn sure you know who you're sharing the platform with before it starts, because it's much harder to walk away than just to politely refuse to do so in the first instance.
So, Hagai, you've had a terrifically successful career with, one could almost say that it's verging on a portfolio approach with your lecturing and professorship and public speaking, etc. Have you, in your career so far, can you identify people who have helped you along the way, mentors, those who have really steered you away from the landmines, steered you in a direction that's helped you to springboard to another level?
Absolutely. And there are many, and they all are real mentors. And I'm talking about more than 10 people I could name. And one thing I will give myself credit for is I recognized early on in my life how important it is to have the honesty that, there are people who know way more about a particular way of doing something, or even the knowledge or the information, and that all you can benefit from is learning from them. And I still, to this day, and that's my point about analysis, not answers, I surround myself continue still today with people that I can learn from and that I can benefit from. I always try and create win-win relationships where we're both benefiting from it. And by the way, I'm very lucky in my work in that often people are paying me to be in an environment where I'm learning as much as they are. And for me, that's incredibly important. I have the confidence in what I do because I am challenging my own perspective. I am adding information. I'm always looking for the contrarian viewpoint. And part of that came from 3 or 4 mentors 25 years ago who encouraged me on that, and a couple of them who kind of, knocked me down a pedestal or two if I was progressing too confidently. And I think having people who you trust who say, you're great, mate, but with respect, this or that are doing it. You yourself is someone who has given me wise counsel and who I've sought, and you are many of people today who I still seek wise counsel for in this regard. I believe when I went back, before, when you talk about integrity, and again, part of me still, even saying about yourself you have integrity is something I instinctively kind of find difficult to say. But if I have integrity in what I do, it is because I constantly try and find those who know more than me, who have experiences that I don't. And by the way, who might be as expert in my field, but in such different areas that they are going to talk about things that I think I know about, but instantly I'm learning because the angle, the perspective, the viewpoint they come to is one that I'm learning from. And so, when my students come and ask me for advice, I always say to them, always continue to get advice. And this is something I think about myself when I do mentoring, is that there's a lovely idea that it is a poor mentor that is not exceeded by their student. You should be looking that, someone helped you get one rung on a ladder, but that your job is to help them get one rung above you. Terrible educators, terrible people who are academics are ones who think their job is to constantly hold themselves above other people because their importance is what matters to them. What I hope those mentors combined with an increase in confidence over the years with the values that we've talked about have developed within me is the importance of recognizing that you're kind of just the one step in what hopefully is long-term continuous development. And there needs to be an element of contrition within that, of humbleness and of modesty within that. And I think you can get great confidence and great certainty out of actually doing things in a humble and a modest way. And I therefore, and we all have imposter syndrome. When I first, was addressing a government or a major corporation, there's a little bell going off in the back of your head saying, is someone going to work out that, are going to work me out? And I have that less these days. I think it's always healthy to have a little bit of that voice inside your head to keep you honest. But I have less of that today because I hope I have used those mentors and used those who have more knowledge and more detail and more experience as a way of ensuring that when I do give definitive statements in my work, that they're based on those sound foundations rather than me fishing in the dark.
And you do it so well. And you remind me of the philosophy that a good leader always has a great team, in fact, an outstanding team around them that in most instances are better than the leader to deliver on the areas of focus and responsibility. I think that what we've gleaned from tonight is a fabulous understanding of how you actually execute your message and how you make people feel as if they have to explore and become far more curious in the way in which they need to think about their communities, their country, and the global village in which we live. And I'd like to say thank you so much for taking the time to talk tonight. I always, as I've said to you, enjoy our interactions and our discussions, and there's never enough time to talk to Hagai about the work he does and the knowledge that he shares and the challenge he puts out to us. So thank you very much for your time, Hagai, and I look forward to the next occasion when we can have a really interesting, insightful and challenging discussion.
Thanks so much, Garry. Really great to talk to you as ever, and I really enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to this episode. If you enjoyed it, please leave a 5-star review and subscribe for more episodes. And if you'd like to learn more about developing your personal brand, please visit garrybrowne.com.au to get in touch or grab a copy of Brand New, Brand You.